Good morning. I am Jenny French.
And that would make me Anda French. Okay. Okay, so if we're talking about beginnings and ends today, we should tell you that we usually tell stories whenever we give lectures or we give talks. And those stories, of course, usually start with the beginning, go to an end, or sometimes we start in the middle, but we've actually never started at the end. So we decided that that would be a great way to frame talking about why ends are important. Ends are important to us because it's the only way to stop doing things that aren't working and to move forward. And it's a way for us to question and reinvent the processes that we use as architects, right, in our own creative practice, the interfaces that we have with all of the various people that you have to work with in that practice, and some of the typologies and the learned things. The things that are givens are the things that we always have to look at. Do we need to end that? Do we need to begin something new?
And what does that mean for us? Or even more importantly, why is this weird picture on the screen? It's because, honestly, we're trying to frame this through the practice that we have developed together. We are sisters. We also have a weird eye condition, honestly, that only lets us see mostly out of one eye. And this condition has started a way that we actually see ourselves as having a kind of hybrid collective way of seeing things differently than other people, but more importantly, different than one another. And we actually think it's really important that we're not seeing the same thing. And our practice kind of talks about this and how we build collectivity through seeing together. Yeah.
So we're going to present you with four ends from the last 5 years of our practice. And 5 years is important to us because it's for the last 5 years, Jenny and I have been in the same place at the same time, running our practice full time. Of course, probably it's been several decades that we thought about that. We were like 5 years old, like what can we do together? But we actually sat in the same place 5 years ago. So we start with the first end that gets us to a beginning. So the end of too much stuff is the beginning of our story. It means the beginning of new experiences and living with less. So of course, this is a general theme in culture right now, right? So we have this feeling that we need less stuff, but we can't seem to agree on how to do that, right? So there's the tiny house movement. We're all familiar with HGTV. There's Colin Wright on the right-hand side, and he's of exile lifestyle, and he believes it's either 51 or 72 objects is all that he owns.
I think he worked down from 72 to 51.
Okay, so he's down to 51.
He's better. He has less graphic tees this time.
Right. There's ideas of zero waste, right? There's upcycling everything. These are all really important ways to think about how we use stuff. They're hard things if you're an architect, right? Because we build new stuff, and we have to figure out how we can address this issue within our own practice. For us, it required seeing that what we're really doing is we're designing experiences first, and then we're having to produce the kind of physical environment around that. And that allows us to then frame what we do in a larger cultural experience. So in the case of living with less stuff, one thing that you have to think about is we're in Boston. If you want to live closer to experiences, you pay more. And so there's a kind of relationship to that idea and what kind of housing model we need in this city.
Yeah. So really in our work, that turns into an exploration of compact living and this kind of conversation around whether or not we call it compact living or micro housing. I mean, we've kind of gone through these names, and
micro housing is out. If
micro housing
knows.
is
Apparently
out,
the term.
Living,
don't say it.
Exactly. But so basically, the backstory here is you're seeing one of 180 compact living units that are actually just up the street that we designed and have been completed for the last 2 years.
1047 Com Ave.
1047 Com Ave. And basically, the story of this project is the story of housing in Boston, right? The housing stock in Boston is a lot of 3-family houses where maybe a family of 5 once lived, and now 3 or 4 grad students live in that same unit. The rents are jacked up. Families can't live in those same places. They get pushed out, right? So part of this building, which was once a 1-story garage when Com Ave was a lot of car showrooms, and then it got added 5 stories of housing on top of that, was trying to address exactly this, which is especially how do we take the pressure off of grad student housing and turn it into a way to kind of do a kind of housing swap out and maybe free up other stock. Of course, supply and demand, we still need more supply to get at this. But kind of the important thing that we had to learn here was thinking about how do you reduce the footprint of your life and still have those things sort of jigsaw puzzled back into one space. You have a kitchen, a bed space, an office space perhaps, and a living room all in the same
450 square feet.
450 square feet, and some are 350. Yep. So in New York, a compact unit is 250 square feet. In Hong Kong, it's 150 square feet. Right? So the sliding scale of what compact is also another thing we could talk about. But what's more important to us is honestly thinking about this as a new typology of domestic space and is kind of dipping a toe into this total sea change that consumption is not necessarily the only way that we can form our identity of our domestic life. And it's also about kind of dipping a toe into a new way of living. But the social aspects of this are really the thing that we care about the most.
So if this is step one in the 4 Ns, and over our last 5 years of practice, we start the story with, okay, we got you to get rid of your stuff, but now you're alone in a room. So we need a new end, right? So the next slide is the end of going it alone. For us, that's the beginning of sharing more of our lives. So next slide is, in our work, we further experiment with housing typologies, and it has to be now combined with some social change, right? Some ways in which you can fine-tune the architecture to work with a different social compact of people who are going to live here. So this is another project of ours that's actually about to go into construction, and it's a co-housing community. And co-housing, these terms are all over the place now. There's co-living, there's co-housing, there's communal living. Co-housing is very specific. It started in the 70s in Denmark.
I mean, there's other models. People, yeah, it has started in many places.
This is the party line, is it started in Denmark.
Yes.
in the 70s. And it came to America. There are about 130 of these technically co-housing communities, and they're basically condominiums or single-family houses that are all grouped together around a common house or common spaces that are all shared. The idea here is that you have your own unit, right? So there's a 2-bedroom unit, there's a 1-bedroom unit, but then you have these large living rooms and dining rooms so that when you want to be part of this larger community, you come together in those spaces.
I call it a condo commune. It's probably the easiest way to get it in 2 words.
So how do we as architects get at this idea of co-housing and designing our creative practice to redesign and rethink some of these things? The first thing is that we have to question what family means and what possessions and spaces you need that are personal and what are shared. Co-housing is about supporting a support system that is it's bigger than your sort of maybe a 2 or 4 person family. It's a larger community, but it's as close. We have to question what social norms then are about closeness and sharing and space, ownership and status. So a lot of the things here that the ends that we're calling for have a lot to do with ego and the ways in which we have to assign our own status or our meaning to things and objects and legible things, and think more about what notions of success are.
And it's particularly interesting, I think, in this case of co-housing, most of which involves home ownership, unlike co-living, which we now see as synonymous with we live or other potentially kind of like what we used to call a kind of furnished short stay apartment. This is, I am going to set up my life and share it with other people. And to us, it's really starting to address isolation, loneliness, people who are aging in place, people who want to have kind of, grandchildren by association, or grandparents by association. It's pretty great. So what does that mean for architecture? It means that we have a kind of, if we go back 1 slide, it's just thinking about scaling up domestic spaces. So suddenly we have a dining room that has to kind of feel cozy, but now we have to seat 100 people, right?
Or 2 people.
Or 2 people. And also have these spaces within your unit, but the units are a little bit smaller, so we kind of take that compact living notion so that I'm not too comfortable drowning in my way too big unit, and I'm actually kind of encouraged to come outside of my door. So a lot of adjacencies, relationships to seeing common space, a courtyard, this central kind of living room, which is attached to the large dining room, which is attached to this big communal kitchen. become really the scaled up version of a single house. And more importantly, the question really that most people ask is like, how do you do this? And for this project, there are 30 units, and that means we have sometimes upwards of 60 people in a room that are our clients when we have a client meeting. And can anyone imagine having 60 clients in a room all trying to design their own personal space?
It's like if all of you right now wanted to build a house together, right?
Like
so
the
we're
first,
like, come on
like,
over. Let's just
6 rows
draw
of
it.
people. Let's all talk this out.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? Architecture school did not prepare us for this at all. Basically, we had to come up with a design process that involved things like this, right? Participatory design models where we kind of set up, the parameters, like, we know what's feasible. We can talk about the volumes of spaces that need to be added together, and it's really letting others into that design process with us so we can actually point to what is the impact of stacking all these units vertically? What is the impact of terracing them together into another form? What do we all think about the aesthetics of a tall window versus a short window? Oh, it's a lot of things.
Requires consensus.
Yes.
You want to talk?
And
you
so,
talk about
and consensus is really the model, and the model that this group uses is probably the closest to a Quaker meeting, in which everyone sees the power in adding their voice to the conversation. And so if you are moved to speak either for something or to block something, then everyone respects that and gives that space. And we're always trying to move forward with a decision, not just by majority rule, but actually by making sure anyone who had a reservation or even like a really strong feeling against something can move forward with the group and not just now be alone on an island with their arms crossed, mad at everybody.
And so
right?
that's called a block. Like
Yeah.
literally, if in this room, one of you didn't want to move forward, we'd have to all stop and say, okay, we can't move forward until we've listened to what the seriousness of this, the problem is, and then we can offer some ways to make some changes and move forward. This sounds like it's a huge mountain to get over, but it has worked beautifully because
Yeah.
it actually makes us think before we speak, right? This idea that do I really want to stop the process here, or am I okay if I move forward? Or is it so important to me that I can argue for it? And it's been really beautiful to see that happen.
Yeah, and a lot of this is just like us learning to joke around with our clients, understand them as people, and it brings up this kind of something that might come to mind when you're talking about the condo commune, which is, does this just promote groupthink? Everyone has to be sort of flattened into a monolithic group. And it's actually not at all. It's just getting over the hurdle of the social awkwardness that might make you never want to talk to someone again. Suddenly, everyone else has said, oh no, that person's living with us, and you guys better get over this. And once you realize you have to do that, it is the expanded idea of family. Yeah.
Okay, so if we're in our story now, you're not alone in your room anymore. Consensus has become the local answer to the question of, but if you don't go it alone, how do you really go it together? How do you make that work? So now we're sitting in a room with your new definition of what a household or a family is. So for us, it's how do we extend this model out to the larger community? So that leads to the third end, the end of talking without listening, the beginning of listening and understanding. Again, these are truisms that in any creative practice you can make this statement, but then you've got to figure out how can you align the processes of your own work to actually get at some of these ideas. So for us, that was really acknowledging that, we keep saying this, architecture is not really about the buildings, right? It's about the structural dynamics that are created through those buildings. It's about the supported relationships, facilitating those experiences. So we took a huge sort of step back and said, if we're not building a building, what can we build? What do we build? And we built a dinner and a space for that.
And so this was at one of the first of these dinner series. It was we're calling place setting, right? It was kind of almost like a stage set. It's about the table and its interactions, and it was at Hub Week in 2017, which is now feeling very long ago. But Elena is here somewhere in the audience, who then is also connected to our co-housing clients, and we met her at Hub Week, and it's amazing that these things come full circle. But essentially, what we set up was a kind of strange environment, an almost fun house-like environment that also produced a kind of proscenium stage. So we invited people for 4 different meals, and at each of these meals, we gave a kind of heading or a topic, and we invited people who were specifically engaged in working either in kind of grassroots, like really activist graphic designers, people who were really promoting ways of looking at these things, and institutional partners, people who were much more ivory towery, we might say. And we put them in the same space, and we had them share a meal together and talk about urban agriculture, civic media and engagement, the housing crisis, which was a big one and kind of overlapped with our other interests. And
cooperative economies.
And cooperative economies.
For dinners.
And we gave everybody a kind of menu of talking items and sort of tried to guide it's almost like speed dating, it's almost like Mad Libs, trying to structure a conversation to produce a kind of accountability to get to the heart of the matter, so everyone didn't just revert to small talk that didn't get deep enough. And there was no one was the host except for us, but we were kind of off to the side. People, this was on Boston City Hall Plaza, came up and listened to these conversations as they were happening. They were getting kind of projected by the surfaces.
So we created a weird enough experience that everyone was a little bit vulnerable and had to kind of bond together, right? We're like, wow, we're in this together. What
like
have these people put us
dinner
into?
theater.
Yeah. And then it actually
Yeah.
produced these incredible conversations. We then followed up. In our practice, we realized that we make a lot of assumptions, we make a lot of hypotheses about how people will use space, but we don't really follow up on those things. So we pair it up with, again, we kept it in the family. So my husband, who is a design researcher, and we had him—
BU grad?
Yeah, BU grad. We had him work through talking to everyone after the dinners and finding out what that experience is like in order to go to the next kind of round. And that, some people may be in creative practices where that's like a given, like how could you not ask people if it worked afterwards? But in this particular world of architecture, it's not done.
Yeah.
So we're trying to work through
Like,
that
what
kind
is
of
the
model.
post-occupancy study that doesn't take the 2 years to design the building, the 2 years to build it, and then 2 years, so like this was kind of immediately after we got to have conversations about what had happened. We also made literal place settings out of pieces of paper and had people leave comments either at the meals or after the meals when we were kind of sitting around on Boston City Hall Plaza explaining what it is that we were doing. And this became a kind of asynchronous conversation among people leaving their thoughts.
Okay, so if in our story now, everything was great at dinner, we're all in a room together, we can talk to each other, we can have different opinions, and we can move forward. Our last concern in this sort of ending and beginning process is how do we prevent old patterns, bad habits from stopping our progress, right? And this is a kind of course, these things all apply to much larger ideas, right? But in the sort of architecture world, we're thinking about you've got to end one-dimensional history, and you've got to begin embracing the complexities of the present. So this one is like a harder, doesn't really have like the quick elevator pitch as much, but it's really about not allowing our sort of one-dimensional view of an idealized history to overly project and stifle what we see as our present and moving forward. I think.
I mean, we don't need to tell you guys that this obviously relates to our current cultural moment in very scary ways.
Yeah.
But maybe in architecture.
Yeah. There we go.
Over to you.
Yeah. Next slide. So in architecture, there's a kind of tangible example of this, right? And it's preservation. So this is the city of Boston. Preservation rules, right? We have this idea that—
I mean, it's our whole economy, and get our baked beans. We got to see Paul Revere's house.
Right.
We grew up in Charlestown. Shout out to Lisa, who lives down the street,
Yeah.
and Sophia. Yeah, we understand.
Yep.
There's a lot of history.
So to build anything in the world of Boston, preservation becomes this really important element. In other practices, it might be a sense of common sense to reinforce norms, or the way we've always done it as a way to avoid experimentation and the possibility of failure, and then sort of using dominant precedents that were once innovative. And I think this is maybe we're at this little precipice point now where something that was innovative in a certain context maybe starts to become the precedent that stifles, and that we have to remember to continue to evolve in that case.
I mean, and we all see that in really short time scales in all of our jobs, where it's like, oh, give them the old number 7, right? Like, we did this before, this worked, particularly in design practice, the kind of, oh, we fixed this, now we can move on, right? Unfortunately, things don't work that way.
So our last project then is Outlier Lofts. You want to talk about that really quickly?
So what you just saw on the screen, which was probably confusing to anyone who
Yeah,
doesn't
take it back.
really read architectural
1 second, then
drawings.
we're done.
One slide back. Thank you, Sophia.
And we're done. Bye. Good night.
No. Okay. I'm sorry, Sophia. Okay, these are our orthographic drawings, right? These are elevations and these are plans. And this is a little building in Charlestown that we just converted into 3 flat style lofts. It was once 2 side-by-side townhouses. There was a potato shed fire. I don't know what that necessarily is, but potato sheds caught on fire. The 3rd floor burned off. It then became one of the most infamous bars in Boston, and it was featured in The Town. So Ben Affleck obviously is the historian of Boston now, but it was involved in lots of, it was unnamed shady business, obviously. And it also didn't allow women in the front of the bar, which is very strange. Anyways, I'm digressing. The point is,
a lot to say about it. It's really exciting.
Basically, essentially, what we did, instead of return this to the side-by-side townhouses, the kind of correct version of its former self, we decided to give it a kind of architectural, hedgehog, mohawk, and allow this one side that faces Route 93 and the highway and the orange line that no one really, the town doesn't really care about. It doesn't need it for its historic front.
The Preservation Society
didn't worry about it, but then so it has a kind of straight-laced street face and then has this funny haircut. And the funny haircut allows for a new way of seeing the interior space for us.
It allows us to make a practice model that uses playfulness, right? So to lift the idea that a history can be part of a present and that we can actually start to mix things. We also looked at certain parts of creative practice in architecture, which are, how do we present the project when it's done? Well, we usually stage the project. So someone comes in, puts all the furniture in that looks like somebody really lives there. We project this life that could possibly be there, and then the furniture leaves.
Our TV life, yeah.
Right, exactly. The furniture leaves the next day, and now we have these photos of it. So we decided that was not what we're going to do. Instead, we're going to use this process of kind of staging it with the different eras, the different histories, and bring those things through.
Potatoes, Barstool,
potatoes,
I don't know.
exactly.
But they're basically having like a very solemn one-act play tableau situation here. That guy is really contemplative. Just looking at the highway.
He's mourning the past. So then the last slide. Okay, so here's this building. It's got the straight-laced front on this side. Kind of looks like a mansard roof, which Boston's okay with. And then we've got the sort of hedgehog guy on the side. We're trying to say that we're essentially saying that this model can apply to different fields, right? Education, art practice, market research, the idea that we underestimate that people and context evolve, so that if we say, this is what people like, so we're gonna make that thing, we've already missed the mark on what could be the possibility of that future. So that's sort of our own take on that way of working.
Yeah, no, and so obviously we're not calling for ignoring history, right? But sometimes orthodoxy of preservation or being stuck on one period of time that was good for some people and obviously not great for others, and then trying to reproduce that is paralyzing and stultifying, and it's actually not all giving us the moment of the present to kind of reimagine and resynthesize what we see.
So in terms of that moment of the present, we have to thank Sophia for inviting us to do this, because it's allowed us in a way to, every time you give a talk, you kind of rediscover things about yourself, and it's a way to talk together. And so we started to realize that, okay, if we're talking about these 4 ends and the last 5 years, what we really have been talking about the whole time is forms of empathy, right? And this idea that in the first example, when we're talking about stuff, it's empathy for self, right? It's not buying things and needing things to feel better, but to actually kind of face oneself and be kind.
And we see, Marie Kondo, right, her Netflix show is actually just therapy, right? Yeah. And it's like therapy and relationship therapy via stuff. It's very sweet. We understand it now.
Yeah. In the second example, we realized that when you're talking about going it alone and not going it alone, we're talking about having empathy for your family, but the most important thing is defining what that family is and maybe expanding that definition to kind of produce some more, some different types of, in our case, living and housing.
And that is definitely, if anyone wants to come and talk to us later, that's the thing that we're probably most excited about is totally redefining domestic spaces and situations and buildings and ownership models to produce these new networks of home and of extended network of people. I don't
And
know.
then in the last two examples, we think this idea of, talking without listening, instead listening, understanding, that's obviously empathy for strangers, something that we need to kind of work through. And then we realized that the last one, this kind of 1D history idea and ending that, is really about an empathy for the future us, right? It's understanding that when we produce these kinds of architectures, again, an architecture project can take 5 to 10 years from the day that you start on it till it actually exists. So it's a little bit of like the Oregon Trail, like you get there and like you're with an entirely different group of people than you started, and you're on the other side of the country. Like we realize that there's a kind of built-in empathy for like, what's the future us going to think of this thing? And then you go even further. So that's kind of how we've wrapped up this idea of endings and beginnings. And we thank you guys for coming out and listening to us, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Yeah.